Start perhaps by saying that this paper is published in English in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis in 1991, immediately before the Congress in Buenos Aires. So you may read it if you have the interest and the opportunity. Here I try to discuss what I call the extra-analytic contacts, and meaning interactions between a patient and an analyst outside the setting of psychoanalysis, that is to say, beyond either the social roles or the physical boundaries of time and space of the psychoanalytic sessions. Social exchanges can be out of road and may also happen within the space and limit time of the analytic session. For instance, if the analyst suddenly develops some illness, even a minor one, and the patient notices it, of course the analyst in that moment is not longer the healer or provider of helpful interventions to restore health, but is in some way a sick person. I am reminded of improvised dialogue between two famous American comics in the 60s, Michael Nichols and his partner, who was a woman, used to improvise dialogues like between a patient and an analyst. And there was a very funny one in which she was the patient and the analyst had hiccup in the middle of the session. So you were hearing the patient associating, and you hear it, and the patient started, "Hold your breath, doctor, hold your breath for a while." And then went on analyzing again his free association, and then you hear, then she said, "A glass of water, doctor, please, please." and she kept on talking, and then and then she went, "Well, a brown bag and breathing in it." But it was clearly a caricature of this situation of the role reversal, which the patient became there with the hiccup of the analyst, the one who helped the analyst to overcome the symptom, and the analyst couldn't control it. Well, often and easily these extra-analytic contacts can be overlooked and not considered at all, as if it were non-analytic. More even so, since they compound the transference, blurring the distinction between illusion and reality, it would be like not fully awakening from a dream and believing that what we were experiencing there actually happened. When the transference limit is in some way ignored and blurred, and instead of hanging all the transference fantasies somewhere and labeling them fantasy, the whole thing, these feelings seem real, makes exploring the extra-analytic contacts difficult, so that they can easily be avoided or acted out in some way in the middle of a confusion. Is it real? What's going on? In some way, we develop, and the lack of literature on this subject, the relative scarcity of papers on the subject, speaks of the fact that we develop a certain phobia about the breaking of our boundaries or the breaking of the setting, and therefore we tend to ignore the extra-analytic contacts because of challenging the, let's say, purity of the setting, and in some way threatening to breaking it. This is even more I would say, tragic or dramatic. In small groups or small societies where analytic groups are developing, because the extra-analytic contacts between candidates and training analysts or supervisors is all around. And what to do with the information you get during those extra-analytic contacts, acknowledge them, deal with them, talk about them, or just keep it, we don't talk, it's the emperor's clothes, you don't talk about it. The emperor has clothes, of course, yes, he has clothes. And in some ways, a phobic convention not to talk about this as if we're bad manners. You don't mention that. And in that sense, we missed opportunities and we miss what may frequently be important analytic material. Because guess what? What is the nature of the fantasies that breaking the setting may bring up? What? Fantasies of primal sin, obviously. Fantasies on the part of us of being caught with our pants down and having our intimacy and our secrets revealed. And secrets are, in some way, the epitome or the caricature of our sexual private life and our partners and our life with them that we want to hide. The most important piece of information going out of the setting is the case of the pregnancy of the female analyst. She cannot hide that she had intercourse and is carrying a baby. But often the patients don't want to see that. I supervised the case of an obstetrician who was a psychoanalytic patient and missed completely the pregnancy of his female analyst in spite of his specialty. He couldn't tolerate the reality that was only brought to his attention when she had to have a break to deliver the baby. And then post facto put two and two together and was appalled by his denial and his phobic avoidance of this obvious piece of information that has been paraded by him. In some way, conventionally, we may distinguish between extra-analytic contact between patients that are ordinary patients, non-candidates, I mean, and those that are candidates. With the non-candidates, it's a breaking of the anonymity, as I said, being caught with the pants down. In some way, often intensifies transference that seems to be verified in the fantasy of the patient, or have an increased phobic avoidance. I want to talk about it. With the candidates in training, of course, there are the many educational and institutional issues where the candidates have opportunities to hear a lot of information about the analysts or supervisors, and not only that, often these forms, the corridors gossip, juicy comments that candidates relish in practicing. On the other hand, one can say that extra-analytic contacts are in some form part of the real relationship between the patient and an analyst, together with other parts such as, the real relationship is a therapeutic task in which both are involved. And the personality style of the analyst that differs from analyst to analyst has some influence that in some ways is reality. But beyond this reality, there comes the other elements that are added, that distorted by the fantasy and make the extra-analytic contact an opportunity to elucidate some confusion by examining how the transference is modified or in some way avoided when getting accidentally together some more information about the analyst, and the patient may observe him or her without the mask of anonymity that we use as an actor's role when we enter stage, the masculine anonymity. In Topeka, Jerome Katz, a training distinguished analyst, was an excellent actor, and he played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof in the Topeka Theater, Community Theater, 29 times. He wrote about extra-analytic contacts, and he described that during those 29 performances, in the audience there were analytic patients and candidates of him, and he wrote that he was convinced that each one of those patients perceived him accurately or distortedly with fantasies, not because or derived from his performance of Tevye, but determined with the patient's built-in previously formed transferences. In some way, in his experience, his acting did not alter the transference of the patients, but in some way crystallized what they had originally been prone to develop anyway. And the roadmap of my presentation on this topic would be, I'll compare the illusion in the analytic stage with the illusion in the dramatic stage, in the theater, based both on the suspension of disbelief. Then I will try to describe the clinical characteristics in which we can generalize extra-analytic contacts can be described, and finally I will deal with some questions that they raise. Both in the drama and in the psychoanalytic stage, both require adopting a mixture of emotions, fantasies, and memories that are contained within an artificial setting that is previously agreed on, and in some way promotes regression by suspending the disbelief and concentrating instead on the action and the interactions on stage, in an illusion that we are witnessing something that is developing and is intriguing. Jacinto Benavente was a Spaniard who got a Nobel Prize in Literature and who wrote in 1917 The Bonds of Interest, a famous play that he wrote for puppets to make it even more, let's say, extra-human, but at the same time caricaturesque. And he wrote the prologue with which the presentation of the bonds of interest starts as follows. Here you have the set of the antique farce, which enlivened the hard-earned leisure of the Carter in the country inns, which made the simple rustic gape with wonder in the square of every rural town and village. Men of every rank and condition shared in the rejoicing, for nothing is so contagious as this sympathy of laughter. The author is aware that so primitive a spectacle is unworthy of the culture of these days. Hence, he throws himself upon your goodness of heart. He only asks that you should make yourself as childlike as possible. An invitation to regression. Regression that happens, of course, as a main characteristic when on the couch in an analytic setting. Reality somehow is transitorily left aside in both drama and couch, and a dreamlike illusory situation develops, whereby fantasies disguise or hide reality. If reality becomes threatening, there's always the comforting thought, if the tragedy and stage is awful, this is just fiction, remember, it's just theater. Or if it happens that it's so threatening that you feel that you are a monster, if you have this fantasy regarding your analysis and the transfer, you can say, this is just transference, this is just a fantasy, it's not important. Or when a child in play analysis is about to be close to break a toy with anger that he is about to smash, the child may say, it's just a toy, meaning it is no consequence of my aggression. Defining clearly our setting, we need it. It's an extra guarantee against the potential of the eruption of sudden, unacceptable, crude reality elements that we don't want to deal with. More even so, the ruptures of the setting can provoke intense anxiety in both partners because of the sudden appearance of repressed aspects of reality that we cannot deal with. Essentially, reality of the primal sin situation, the reality of the female analyst having been impregnated by her husband and having another person very important in her life besides and beyond and above the obstetrician male patient who attended her analytic sessions and couldn't realize, couldn't accept that she was pregnant. Couch and stage focus attention thus in a regressive emotional aspect in which affects are the spotlight. Like the spotlight illuminates where the action is on the stage, affects underscore where the action is, highlights where to look at for the analyst or the patient. But all of this within limits clearly setting. In the psychoanalytic stage, the patient is the protagonist. The stage is mainly, perhaps we could say, inside his mind, inside the patient's mind. The audience is formed together by the analyst and by the observing ego of the patient, who is witnessing what is going on the stage. In some way, prompters in the drama and the voice of supervisors in the mind of the analyst may help focus attention on the flow of the performance. Performers can be carried away by fantasies and emotion. As I quoted the case of the kid in play analysis almost about to break a toy, carried away by anger, and then taking refuge in reality. Oh, it's just a toy, it doesn't matter that I broke it. Certain aspects of reality are not to be seen or paid attention. In some way, there's a convention not to look at it, like the emperor's clothes. In a drama of Japanese puppetry, bunraku is a very peculiar and wonderful art of using puppets that are an exact replica of human beings, but half-sized human beings, and are handled by puppeteers who move them from behind in performances that really look like actors, but a small size of actors. The puppeteers are dressed with black hoods and black robes, so that in the background, with all this black, you don't see them. You are not supposed to see them. You focus on the puppets that move, act, talk, and sing and dance, but you don't see the black-robed puppeteers. In some way, many aspects that we avoid in the analytic situation not focusing attention on certain elements and focusing instead on other ones that are fantasized elements that we prefer. So you can say that there's a dynamic balance or a middle ground between fantasy and reality that occur in analytic situation in general and also in the extra-analytic context. In general, both actors and analysts have established and respect and follow clearly established rules of the game. The prevalence of fantasy over reality within certain specific limits, social, physical, allowing an automatic return to reality when the curtain falls, the theater lights are on, or the clock indicates that the session is over. But there are exceptions to the rule. A dream seems sometimes so real that the confusion between the fantasy expressed in the dream and the reality when we wake up is such that we would like to go on with the dream, ready to continue it somehow. Also, it happens, the confusion sometimes between the stage and the street. I had once, I'm a person fond of theater. I attended a play in Madrid in 1975 that represented on the stage some crisis during the civil government of the Republic of Spain before the Franco Revolution in 1936, when there was a crisis in the government and there was a political turmoil in Madrid, a preface of the civil war that was about to start on July 36. It was a well-written drama, it was powerful. After the show, we went to the streets, we were a group of analysts who attended this play, and guess what? It was 75, Franco had died. There was a transition to a civilian government after Franco, and there were agitated manifestations on the streets of Madrid with flags and songs and fanaticism on display. It was like a blurring between the stage of the drama that you have just witnessed of what happened in 1936 in Madrid and what was going on in that moment, almost as if the play continued. These states of transition, in some way, are one of the ways in which we can describe the extra-analytic contacts. They are not only interference of the external reality impinging on the analytic setting, but happen subjectively in what Winnicott called the area of illusion, the transitional space, an intermediate area that makes possible both the distinction and the confusion between inner and outer reality, in which they are blended and we don't know where is where, and in some way offer us special, although disturbing and not always clear opportunities of analysis. Let me again remind us, among the clinical characteristics of extra-analytic contacts that I'm going to refer, the confusion and avoidance that we have vis-a-vis these contacts. Because these contacts seem to violate the analytic setting with an element of surprise. And the patients may instead choose to deal with spontaneous transference fantasies rather than dealing with the immediate counter extra-analytic. And we are prone to keep our anonymity behind the mask and that aspect of our role as a defense to continue the analytic performance on the analytic stage. In some way, it takes an effort of our attention and our analytic curiosity to bring up the extra-analytic contacts to the patient's attention, precisely and mainly the defensive avoidance, perhaps because of shame or guilt or anxiety, or for the wish of peeping into something forbidden and secret. We may be tempted to collude with the patient's avoidance, and we have to make an effort to bring to the attention and flow of free associations of the patient whatever happened outside. So the task becomes an invitation to the patient to specifically associate on their defenses that are avoiding deal with the extra-analytic contact that may have happened recently. On our part as analysts, probably we don't like having our control of the setting being disturbed, and we would like to just keep it as an analytic routine without mentioning whatever extra-analytic contact happened. One of the examples I wrote in the paper about it is the following one. In Santiago, many years ago, it happened to me that I arrived to the building of my office in the car of a colleague who was a blonde, attractive analyst woman who had given me the lift and was dropping me just a few minutes before my first appointment, just in the moment when the first patient was arriving and also walking on the sidewalk to enter the building. So she saw the car, she saw the driver, she saw me, we entered the office, session started. No mention of what happened out. I have to tell her, maybe we should explore what just happened before we entered the building, and you don't seem to prefer to address it. Some hesitancy. She was the granddaughter of a president in the middle of the 19th century of my country, member of the Chilean aristocrat. And she said, I saw a woman driving a car you dropped by. In our family, we all have drivers. It's a low-class thing, women driving, not elegant. Obviously, she had some blood in her eye. And then she said, however, I tried to learn how to drive once. And she suffered of depression and abuses of alcohol. And her attempt to drive was interrupted by her having accidents under the influence of alcohol. So she associated to this with some distress and sadness. But at the same time, noticing that there was a part of her that in the past had wanted to drive in spite of her aristocratic comments. Then I should add that an antecedent that I didn't mention. This woman's husband was a well-known Don Juan who had even gone to the extreme of once being caught by a jealous husband and having to run away through various roofs naked and making the front page of the newspaper. So she had some story of being in some way replaced by attractive women and jealousy of a very Don Juanesque husband. So she started saying something not in reference to the driver, but spontaneously came to her mind memories of how beautiful her mother was. Her mother had been a queen in queen of beauty in different organizations, and although the patient was herself very attractive, she considered herself ugly, well below the beauty of her mother, unworthy of being loved somehow. All of which was coming out of an interaction, an extra-analytic encounter. And I had to, in some way, congratulate myself for having brought up her resistance to associate about her, calling her attention to her phobic avoidance, and inviting this material out. That was very productive material. Guess what? The happy story ends up with her determination that she would learn to drive. And she did learn to drive and overdid it now from then on, offering everybody a lift in the family and being ready. And guess what? Alcoholism was eliminated in the process. So I scored in the family thanks to this extra-analytic contact. Well, with ordinary patients, it goes like that. With candidates, extra-analytic contacts happen in the classes, in the scientific meetings, in the institute functions. In some way, the treatment plus education, that is not just analysis, but it's also a training, education in becoming an analyst, promote a legitimate identification with the analyst on the part of a candidate. But in the small institutes, there's a lot of potential for acting out, for taking sides on the political struggles that occur in every analytic institution, and in some way to belong to party blue or party red, and in some way collude into the political struggles that sometimes analysts, training analysts, we have used for our narcissistic needs to get supporters on our side against the enemy, so to say. In small institutes or beginning stages of development of society, this is often the case, and hostility often is underanalyzed and somehow acted out. And often supervisors are the displaced recipients of the transference that does not appear clearly with the analyst. I think I want to express again what are the ideas about the reality within analysis. There is a reality in addition to these fantasies. As I said, the task that both engage in, analyst and patient, examining the actual experiences within a contract, within a setting, within what are the real expression of the real self and personality style of the analysts. But comparing the two areas of the patient mental fantasy, the mental functions, comparing reality and fantasy is what indeed is the essence of examining the transference and doing good analytic work. This is what we do as analysts. Without our reacting with either seduction or rejection or counter-aggression, we help the patient to do a comparison in his own mind between the fantasy of what the patient expected the analyst will do or behave like and what actually happened. It's a little bit what Alexander called the corrective emotional experience. You remember in his book, Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy or so, Alexander quoted as an example of a corrective emotional experience a piece of literature well known, the chapter of Les Misérables, when Jean Valjean, the main character, having stolen the golden candelabers of the bishop, is called by the bishop to visit him in the bishop's palace. And Jean Valjean goes there convinced that the bishop has called the police and would put him in jail. And to his surprise, the bishop invites him for dinner, and during dinner tells him, I know you stole my golden candelabers, and I want to give them to you as a gift. In other words, the corrective emotional experience, the opposite of the feared fantasized expectation, is in some way what we offer in our real task. There are important fantasies about the setting. And this may sound a little too theoretical, but I want to talk about it anyway. José Blecher, an analyst from Buenos Aires, described long ago how the setting becomes, in the fantasy of the patient and of the analyst, a container of the analytic process. It's a place where an early symbiotic and unnoticed mother transference takes refuge, is repeated there, transferred to the setting, and silently lodged in the setting. The unconscious persecutory anxiety that is always in our minds. Remember the propaganda about 9/11 and how that can be exploited and how it can be made a reason to vote for one party or another, exploiting the persecutory anxiety that is the main fear that we human beings all share and is the most powerful feeling, is implicit always in any relationship, the fear of being abused, of facing an enemy. And this is happening in the transference constantly, but the setting gives us the symbiotic confidence of this is something stable, immutable, that is working and is reliable. But if the setting becomes dramatically explicit because it's rupture, this may cause the latent transference psychosis of these paranoid fears to explode instead of remaining unnoticed and immobilized within the alleged immutability of the setting. That may explain why, for instance, my friend, the male obstetrician, was unable to diagnose the pregnancy of his female analyst. They need to keep the setting immutable. It needs the analyst not as a woman who may get pregnant, but as an analyst, a kind of computer that will function performing the task. The issue of Blecher's theory about the paranoid psychotic transference is a broader issue that in some way transcends my paper, but I should mention that paying attention to projective identification and to acting out may be a way of having some access, mainly observing non-verbal communications, because these primitive emotions express themselves non-verbally, like the incest victim woman who starts analysis and upon lying on the couch keeps her left foot on the ground and turns the head to watch where the male analyst sits, a non-verbal expression of, what, you're going to attack me? Things of these non-verbal messages may help us if we want to explore the latent psychotic paranoid components of transference that are hidden in the stable, hidden behind the stable setting. Another distinction of different types of extra-analytic contacts can be the difference between those that happen by chance and those that happen planned. I described one by chance with the lady who learned how to drive. Regarding the planned ones, let's say that some can be the product of good social manners. If a patient graduates, have a childbirth in the family, have a death in the family, has a serious physical disease, experiences some death in the family, as I said, undergoes divorce, we respond to these realities of the patient's life with our good manners in some way that are not limited to the contract of our role as analysts, but as a human being to another one. There's also the distinction between extra-analytic contacts during the patient's analysis and extra-analytic contacts after the patient's termination. Often there are many opportunities to encounters between analysts and former patients, mainly candidates, in our profession. When we attend congresses or conventions or different scientific meetings, we may interact with those who were before our patients when they were candidates in training. And the role of the question, have we ended the role of being analysts? Or once an analyst, you're always an analyst to the ones that you have analyzed. I tend to think that once you're an analyst, you're always an analyst to someone. In the same way that once you're a father, you're always a father to your children. You cannot change by some kind of adoption of a different role. However, contingent upon the maturity and stability of emotional life of the candidate, some social appropriate collegial interaction is in some way expected and tolerable and also might be enjoyable, although there are the risk of either the former patient trying to relate to us, as in the quote good old times, associating, or our narcissism leading us to adopt a kind of interpretive role when it is inappropriate because analysis has been over for some time. There are also extra-analytic contacts during and outside the session. I described one outside the session now that is different from the one of the lady who learned to drive. A patient of mine learned of a conference that I was going to offer a lecture in Santiago because he read an announcement of it in the newspaper. And then he came to the next session and had the following dream to report. He was embarrassed attending my lecture where I was making a fool of myself, talking about psychoanalysis as if I were reading a primer book and saying, P-S-I-C, spelling the letters of the word and in some way bragging as if this were, the ultimate essence of a wonderful truth that I was opening the eyes of the audience to. And he felt both extremely embarrassed that he had something to do with this fool, and on the other hand, extremely pleased that he was confirming his permanent conviction that I was an idiot. It was interesting because this man is still alive, the nephew of a famous Spanish analyst, Miguel Prados, who was trained in Germany and was one of the founders of the Canadian Psychoanalytic Society and lived in Montreal. He founded the Canadian Society together with Ernest Jones. And this man was Miguel Prados' nephew and had had a special training in Quebec while living in the house of his uncle in the special field that he went into, but had lived for years while training in Quebec in the uncle's home, and was used to have analysts for dinner and to hear analysts talk about analytic concepts and to discuss analytic topics. So he had grown up feeling that he was an insider, he was an analyst, and he experienced me as a newcomer, despicable idiot. On the other hand, all these were significant defenses that I helped him to realize against his envy of me being an analyst and his frustration of not having himself become an analyst and instead follow another activity that made him rich, but he considered much below the glamour of being an analyst that he would have endeared to become. So all of this was triggered by a little announcement in a newspaper about a conference I was going to give, and he's reading about it and was grist for the mill. During the session, there may be important and sometimes funny interruptions of the setting, as I referred to a while ago, sneezing or hiccup by the analyst brings the reality of the analyst breathing of health into the attention of the setting, or something of a catastrophe beyond the control of everyone may happen, like a tornado in Kansas. You know, I worked and lived 20 years in Topeka, and there was part of the analytic setting that during springtime, suddenly your door, the secretary came and knocked at the door, tornado warning to the basement. So in the middle of the session, there you were, we analysts with the anonymous face mask, and patients with all the fantasies on the couch, getting out of the room and going downstairs, not talking, because the session had been interrupted by a kind of different role, responding to the tornado. Or in Chile, we had earthquakes like in Japan, important. A couple of weeks ago, there was one in the place I was born, in the north of Chile. What do you do when you have an earthquake and you are with a patient on the couch? What do you do? Each one has his own way of handling it. I told my patients in Chile, I'm not going to run away, I'm going to stay where I am. You do what you want. but in some way, it's a serious reminder that we are not omnipotent, and Mother Nature has forces that we cannot control and impinge on the setting without any respect. Well, with all these considerations, I'm not promoting or selling the idea that we should increase the frequency of extra-analytic contact as a stimulus to make progress in analysis. I'm just underlining that the basic analytic task of examining the patient's fantasies about the analyst as an expression of the patient's transference are still there and have variations that color the response of the patient to the extra-analytic contact. And by bringing the analytic task back and including the break of the setting in some way restores the setting, in some way brings in what was apparently happening out and irrelevant, and makes it relevant and makes it productive. Then the question of the natural ending of a role, so I referred myself, but it may be debatable. Is it, as I said, that once an analyst, you're always an analyst for who was your patient? In any case, extra-analytic contacts remind us that life is a constant, dynamic, ongoing transition back and forth with an ebb and flow between the pressure principle and the fantasies and the reality principle and its limitations. Thank you.